You don't forget the way a person walks when they once shaped your entire life. Time doesn't erase that kind of memory. Years can pass, faces can change, voices can fade, but movement stays burned into the body like muscle memory. I recognized him before I truly saw him. It was the way he moved, slow, dragging, like each step required permission from the ground. His shoulders slumped forward not from age alone, but from something heavier, regret, maybe defeat. The kind that settles into bone. I was walking out of the bank, documents pressed neatly under my arm. The day had been ordinary in the best way. Bills paid, no panic buzzing in my head, my posture straight, my breathing calm. For the first time in years, I felt like someone who had survived and rebuilt, like someone steady. Then my body stopped, not slowly, not thoughtfully, completely, as if something inside me had recognized danger before my mind could name it. My chest tightened, my breath caught halfway in, and my hands went cold. I hadn't seen his face yet, but my body already knew. He was bent over a dumpster across the street, digging through it with careful hands, not frantic. Not desperate in a loud way, just methodical, like this was routine, like this was work. His fingers were black with grime, sorting crushed cans and scraps as if they held value beyond survival. A torn sack hung from his shoulder, weighed down by whatever he'd found so far. His hair was white now, his beard long and uneven, spreading across his face like he'd stopped caring where it grew. His clothes were oversized and threadbare, hanging off him in a way that suggested weight loss, not fashion. They didn't fit his body anymore, like they belonged to a man who used to exist. And suddenly, the years collapsed. That man had once slept beside me. We had shared space, shared plans, shared arguments about paint colors and furniture and routes we'd take on road trips we never finished. He used to kiss my forehead absent-mindedly, like it was instinct, like the world outside couldn't reach me if he did that first. Now people walked past him without slowing down, without seeing him, without wondering who he had been before this moment. To them, he was just another obstacle on the sidewalk, someone to avoid eye contact with, someone easy to forget the second they passed. The street didn't change for my realization. Cars continued moving. Someone laughed nearby. A bus hissed as it pulled away. Life went on in a straight line while mine fractured in place. My mind kept arguing with itself. It couldn't be him. It shouldn't be him. There were too many memories, too many versions of that man that didn't end like this. But my gut didn't argue. It already knew the truth and didn't care whether I was ready. I felt the urge to turn away, to cross the street, to protect the version of myself that had worked so hard to survive what he left behind. Seeing him like this threatened something fragile inside me. It disturbed the order I'd built from chaos. I had spent years hating him. Hating the silence after he disappeared. Hating the debts that appeared in my name. Hating the mess he left me to clean up alone. I hated how I had to explain his absence to people who asked questions I didn't have answers for. I hated how long it took to stop blaming myself. And now he stood there, reduced to sorting trash to survive. Part of me felt sick. Another part felt something I didn't want to name. A quiet, ugly sense of relief. Like life had finally held him accountable in a way I never could. That thought didn't last long. When a grown man looks at you like he has already accepted the end of himself, it leaves a mark. There is a difference between fear and surrender. What I saw in his eyes was surrender. "Is that you?" I said. The words sounded strange coming out of my mouth, like they didn't belong to me anymore. My voice lacked the certainty I had rebuilt over the years. It cracked slightly, betraying the control I thought I had mastered. He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze dropped to the ground, fast and deliberate, as if eye contact itself caused pain. His shoulders curved inward even more, shrinking his frame. "You shouldn't see me like this," he muttered. "Forget it. Go." The word hit wrong, go, as if this was a minor inconvenience. As if years of silence, confusion, and damage could be erased with a dismissal. As if he still had the right to decide when conversations ended. I didn't move. After everything he left behind, walking away felt impossible. Not because I wanted answers alone, but because pretending this moment didn't exist would mean lying to myself all over again. I stepped closer. That's when the smell reached me. A mix of sweat, unwashed clothes, old concrete, and something hollow beneath it. Hunger, cold nights. The kind of exhaustion sleep doesn't fix. It wrapped around him like another layer he couldn't take off. I looked at him carefully. Really looked. His fingers were cracked and swollen. The skin split in places like it hadn't healed properly in a long time. His shoes were worn through at the soles, barely holding together. His eyes, once sharp and alert, were sunken and dull, like hope had slowly packed its things and left without making noise. This wasn't the man I married. This was what remained after something had gone very wrong for a very long time. "What happened to you?" I asked. The question shook on its way out. Anger and grief collided in my chest, each demanding to speak louder than the other. I wanted to be furious. I wanted to stay distant. But seeing him like this tore holes in emotions I thought were sealed shut. He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just a dry, empty sound that didn't reach his eyes. You don't want to know, he said. I do, I replied sharply. I deserve to, that got his attention. You left me with nothing, I continued. Debt, shame, silence, questions that never stopped circling my head. You don't get to decide what I deserve to know. His eyes darted around the street, scanning faces, windows, passing cars. The movement was nervous, practiced, like someone used to being watched or expecting trouble. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible. You were never supposed to see me again. The words landed heavy. What are you talking about? I asked. He swallowed hard, his throat working like the truth itself was stuck there. I did everything so you wouldn't carry this. A cold sensation slid down my spine. Carry what? I asked. With what? With what? Thaddeus, saying his name felt strange, familiar and foreign at the same time. He flinched when I said it, like I'd struck something sensitive. That's when he looked up at me fully. His eyes were wet, not dramatic. Not pleading, just overwhelmed. Tears sat there, unashamed and unhidden, like they'd been waiting a long time. It was to save you, he said. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet. Save me from what? I asked. My voice dropped without me meaning it to. Begging slipped in where anger used to live. He tried to straighten his back, pride making a last attempt to assert itself, but his body didn't cooperate. His knees buckled, his balance failed, and suddenly he was falling forward. I caught him instinctively. His weight surprised me. He was lighter than he should have been, fragile in a way that terrified me. We went down together, the pavement cold beneath my knees as I held his head in my hands. People reacted around us. Someone shouted. Someone else pulled out a phone. A voice called for an ambulance. I knelt there, cradling his head the same way I used to years ago when he'd get sick and stubbornly refused to lie down. Life has a cruel sense of symmetry. It brings you back to familiar positions just to remind you how much has changed. The sirens came quickly. Inside the ambulance, everything blurred, bright lights, gloved hands, quick questions I couldn't fully answer. A medic rattled off words like they were routine: severe dehydration, anemia, chronic malnutrition. Clinical terms for a slow collapse. I sat there, gripping the edge of the bench, my mind stuck on one sentence. It was to save you. I didn't understand it yet, but I knew one thing: this wasn't the story I thought I lived. At the hospital, he wasn't treated like someone with a past. He was processed like a problem to be managed. No identification, no emergency contact, no family listed in the system. Just another man pulled in from the street, cleaned up enough to keep alive, then parked in a bed under fluorescent lights. I stayed. I didn't announce it. I didn't justify it. I simply didn't leave. Something about everything felt wrong, like the story I thought I knew had been missing entire chapters. His collapse, his condition, the way he spoke in fragments instead of explanations. None of it lined up with the version of him I'd hated for years. When he finally woke up, his first reaction wasn't relief, it was fear. Leave, he said quietly, without opening his eyes. I remained seated. My problems aren't yours anymore, he added. They stopped being yours a long time ago. You don't get to decide that, I replied. You already made decisions that rewrote my life once. He turned his face toward the wall. The motion was slow, deliberate, like he couldn't bear to look at me while saying what came next. I didn't go broke because I messed up, he whispered. I went broke because I obeyed. The word hit me harder than any accusation. Obeyed, my body reacted before my mind did. A chill spread through my arms, my stomach tightening with something close to dread. Obeyed who? I asked. He didn't answer. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. It pressed into the room, louder than any explanation. Silence like that isn't empty. It's crowded with things that don't want to be said. That night, I didn't go home. I slept sitting upright in the plastic chair beside his bed, my jacket folded awkwardly under my head. The hospital never fully sleeps. Machines beeped, shoes squeaked in the hallway. Somewhere nearby, someone cried quietly. I replayed everything in my mind: his sudden disappearance, the short, cold letter, the lawsuits that arrived without warning, the foreclosure notice taped to the door, the years I spent believing he destroyed me and moved on without looking back. I had built an entire version of reality around that belief. It helped me survive. It gave my anger somewhere to live. But now it was cracking. At dawn, pale light crept through the blinds. He shifted in the bed, restless like sleep had failed him too. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by exhaustion. Everything I lost, he said quietly, staring at the ceiling, I lost so you would stay alive. The room felt smaller. I thought you betrayed me, I said. The confession hurt more than I expected. It carried years of resentment, self-doubt, and quiet grief with it. That's what I needed you to believe, he replied. There was no drama in his voice, no pride, just resignation. Something inside me broke open, not loudly. Not all at once, slowly, like pressure released from a place that had been sealed too tight for too long. I wanted to demand details, names, proof, explanations, but another part of me understood that whatever this was, it wasn't simple. People don't erase themselves, destroy their finances, and disappear into shame for no reason. I didn't know who he had been protecting me from. I didn't know what danger had circled my life without my knowledge. I didn't know how deep this went or how much damage still waited beneath the surface, but I knew this much. Running away hadn't been cowardice, it had been strategy. This reunion wasn't random, it wasn't punishment. It wasn't some poetic twist of fate. It was unfinished business forcing itself back into my life, and whether I wanted it or not, I was already involved. Guilt followed it immediately, heavy and sharp. Because no matter what he had done, no matter how deeply he'd hurt me, seeing someone who once shared your life brought this low does something to you. It rearranges your anger. It forces it to mix with grief. Without fully deciding to, I took a step forward. My heels clicked against the pavement, loud in my ears. The sound carried more weight than it should have. He froze. Slowly, he lifted his head. For a brief moment, his eyes passed over me without recognition. Just another person standing too close, then something shifted. His face changed as memory caught up. Recognition hit him hard. His hands began to shake. Not from fear, but from something deeper. Shame, exposed and sudden, like he understood exactly what this moment meant, like he knew I was a chapter he had tried to bury. For a second, we just stared at each other. The past standing across from the present, neither of us prepared for the collision, and in that silence I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a coincidence, this was unfinished. He didn't disappear, he was erased. I waited until the nurses finished their rounds and the hallway outside settled into its late-night quiet. The monitors still hummed softly, indifferent to the weight of what sat between us. I closed the door myself, not because I was afraid of being overheard, but because this conversation didn't belong to anyone else. No witnesses, no interruptions, just the two of us and the truth that had already poisoned years of my life without explanation. I stood near the foot of the bed, arms folded tightly across my chest, grounding myself. "Tell me everything," I said. "No fragments, no protection, no silence. I'm done filling in the blanks on my own." He stared at the ceiling, eyes unfocused, as if the words were written there and he was reading them slowly. His breathing changed, shallower, controlled, like someone preparing for impact. "The day I disappeared," he said carefully, "I wasn't running away." My jaw tightened, waiting. I was supposed to die that day. The words didn't land right away. My brain rejected them outright, like a language it didn't recognize. A short laugh escaped my mouth before I could stop it. Sharp, hollow, defensive. "That's not funny," I said quietly. "I know," he replied. "That's why I never told you." My hands felt numb, cold all the way through. I pressed my fingertips together to make sure I was still present, still standing. "Who would want you dead?" I asked. He finally turned his head and looked at me directly, not with drama, not with fear, with exhaustion. "People with power," he said, "not the kind that threatens loudly, the kind that owns paperwork, judges, and silence." Something inside my stomach dropped. Hard, he told me about the project he'd been working on, a large public construction contract, the kind that came with press releases, ribbon cuttings, and smiling officials, clean on the surface, applauded, celebrated. Underneath, it was rotten. Shell companies cycling money through accounts that didn't exist on paper, inflated invoices for materials never delivered, budgets rewritten and reapproved without scrutiny. Millions disappearing slowly enough that no one questioned it, but quickly enough that someone was getting very rich. "I was the engineer," he said, "the technical authority, the one whose signature made it legitimate." My throat tightened. "And when you realized what was happening?" I asked. "When I tried to report it," he said, his voice cracking despite his effort to keep it steady. "They showed me proof that didn't exist and threats that did." He paused, swallowing hard. "Emails I never sent, transfers I never made, documents with my name already attached. Then they showed me things they had been watching." I felt dread creep up my spine. "Like what?" I asked. He took a breath that trembled despite him. "They put your photo on the table. Everything stopped. They had schedules," he continued quietly. "Routes you took, places you went alone, times you were predictable. They said accidents happen every day and no one ever asks the right questions afterward." I felt physically sick. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. "So you ran," I whispered. "No," he corrected immediately. "I erased myself." He explained it slowly, piece by piece, like laying out evidence. He signed false confessions tied to financial misconduct, took responsibility for crimes that were designed to collapse his credibility completely, transferred assets, drained accounts. Let everything we owned vanish in ways that looked intentional. "So they'd believe the story," he said, "and so they'd leave you alone." My knees weakened. I sat down hard in the chair beside the bed, covering my mouth with my hand as my body shook. "All these years," I said, my voice barely holding together, "my life fell apart because I chose you," he finished. There was no heroism in his tone, no expectation of forgiveness, just fact. I stared at him, seeing the past through a completely different lens. The disappearance, the financial ruin, the silence. None of it was abandonment, it was containment. He hadn't vanished to escape responsibility. He had vanished to redirect danger. and suddenly everything I thought I knew about my own history felt unstable. I didn't realize I was crying at first. There was no sound, no dramatic release. Just tears slipping down my face, steady and quiet, like my body had finally given up on holding everything in place. My chest hurt in a way that felt old, like something that had been there for years but was only now being acknowledged. "You let me starve," I said. The words came out flat, stripped of accusation but heavy with truth. "You let me drown in debt. You let me believe I was worthless, like I didn't matter enough to be told the truth." He closed his eyes. His face tightened, not in defense but in pain. "I know," he said, "and every night it destroyed me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. Instead, I sat there, shaking, trying to reconcile two realities that refused to merge. The man I had hated for abandoning me, and the man sitting in front of me who had dismantled his own life piece by piece to keep mine intact. Then why didn't you come back?" I asked. "If you were alive, if you knew I was suffering, why didn't you find a way?" He shook his head slowly. "Every time I got close," he said, "someone reminded me why distance was the only thing keeping you breathing." My heart pounded harder. "What does that mean?" I asked. He opened his eyes and looked at me fully, not pleading, not apologizing, just honest. "They never stopped watching," he said. "They didn't need to threaten me anymore. They just had to show me you were still alive." The realization hit me all at once, brutal in its clarity. His homelessness wasn't an accident, it wasn't failure, it was enforcement. "They wanted you ruined," I said slowly. "So no one would ever question the story." He nodded. "If I looked unstable, irresponsible, broken," he said, "then everything I touched became questionable. No one listens to a man like that. Especially not when he talks about corruption." My stomach turned. "And you had to hate me," he continued, "because hate keeps people from searching. Love asks questions, love digs. Hate moves on." I stared at him, memories resurfacing with terrifying alignment. The nights I felt watched but told myself I was imagining it. The moments I noticed the same car twice and dismissed it as coincidence. The sudden, unexplainable fear that settled in my chest for no reason at all. I hadn't been paranoid, I had been observed. "They wanted you angry," he said. "Anger keeps you loud but unfocused. It keeps you alive." My throat burned. "You sacrificed everything," I whispered. "Your reputation, your future, your body, your life." He nodded once. "And I'd do it again," he said, without hesitation. I grabbed his hand then, gripping it tightly, grounding myself in something real. "No," I said firmly, "never again." That's when his expression changed, not fear for himself, fear for me. "You don't understand," he said urgently. "If you start pulling at this thread, they won't warn you like they warned me." "Silence almost killed me," I replied. And I've been silent long enough. The room felt different suddenly. Smaller, charged. That's when I noticed the hallway, two men standing too still near the nurse's station. Not doctors, not visitors. Asking questions that didn't match any patient's chart, watching too closely. Listening without appearing to. A familiar cold settled in my stomach. Thaddeus noticed my focus shift, his grip tightened around my hand. "They know I surfaced," he whispered. "They're checking whether I broke." I met his eyes, steadying myself. "Then they underestimated what survival actually does to people," I said. For the first time since this began, he looked unsure. Not because he was afraid, but because I wasn't. He was quiet for a long time after that, too quiet, the kind of silence that signals a decision being made internally, not hesitation. His eyes stayed fixed on the far wall, jaw set, breathing controlled like he was measuring every thought before allowing it to exist. "There's something else," he said finally. I didn't interrupt. Whatever this was, it needed space. "Something I never told anyone," he continued. "Not you, not lawyers, not investigators, no one." I leaned forward slightly, instinctively lowering my voice even though the door was closed. "What is it?" I asked. Before answering, he looked toward the door, then at the window, then back at me. Years of caution were built into that movement, habitual, earned. "Before I disappeared," he said, "I hit a box." My pulse jumped despite myself. "Where?" I asked. "At the old workshop," he replied. "The one I used to rent before everything collapsed. There's a false shelf in the back storage room. Behind it, buried." I pictured the place immediately, dusty, forgotten. Zoned for demolition, but never quite important enough to finish destroying. A place no one would care to search thoroughly. "What's in it?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "The truth," he said. "Original documents, contracts, payment trails. Names that never made it onto official records. Audio files, things that weren't supposed to survive." My stomach tightened. "Then why didn't you use it?" I asked, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Why keep proof and let everything else burn?" "Because proof doesn't protect people," he replied instantly. "It paints targets." He turned his head to look at me. "If I had released that information back then," he said, "you wouldn't be sitting here now." The room went still. "But now," he continued slowly, "they already know I'm alive. They already know I resurfaced. The version of me they controlled is gone." I stood up without thinking. I'm going for it, I said. No, he snapped, more force than I'd heard from him all night. It's dangerous. So was dismantling your entire life, I shot back. And you didn't hesitate when it came to protecting me. He stared at me, searching my face like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years, not as someone fragile, not as someone to shield, as someone capable. A long moment passed, then he nodded once. That night sleep never fully came. Every sound outside the hospital room felt deliberate. Footsteps in the hall lingered too long. Doors opened and closed with weight. My body stayed tense, ready, like instinct knew we were being measured. Just before sunrise, I left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't take my phone out more than necessary. I kept my route indirect, doubling back once, watching reflections in windows instead of turning my head. The workshop stood exactly as memory preserved it, abandoned but intact, dust coating everything, air stale, too quiet. The kind of quiet that amplifies your own breathing. Inside, I moved slowly, deliberately, found the back storage room, counted shelves, ran my fingers along the wood until I felt the difference. The panel gave way easily. He had planned this well. I dug. My hands shook as metal met metal. The box was heavier than I expected. Solid, real, the kind of weight that comes from intention, not coincidence. Inside were folders, labeled in his precise handwriting. Flash drives, external hard disks, old contracts stamped and signed, copies of communications that contradicted official timelines, recordings I didn't dare listen to yet, enough to dismantle reputations, enough to expose systems. Enough to make enemies permanent. As I closed the lid and lifted the box, I heard an engine turn over outside. Not hurried, not accidental. I didn't look back, because once you touch the truth, pretending ignorance is no longer an option. You don't get to step away cleanly. You don't get to unsee what exists. And whatever line had once separated my life from his past, I had crossed it. There was no return to before. The moment you touch the truth, your life changes shape. Not dramatically at first, quietly, subtly, in the way your body reacts before your thoughts catch up, in the way every sound feels closer than it should, in the way normal suddenly feels like a performance. I walked back into the hospital as if nothing had happened. My pace was steady, my expression neutral, my shoulders relaxed just enough to avoid attention. The metal box was hidden inside a plain grocery bag, folded between ordinary items like it belonged there, like it was harmless, like it didn't contain the power to destroy people who never expected to be exposed. But inside, my chest was tight, my pulse loud in my ears. Every step echoed too clearly. Every reflection in the glass walls felt like a potential witness. I didn't rush. Rushing draws eyes. I moved the way people move when they have nothing to hide. Thaddeus looked at me the second I entered the room. He didn't ask questions out loud. He didn't need to. "You got it," he whispered. I nodded once. That was all it took. There was no relief on his face, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Instead, his expression darkened with something closer to grief, like he had just confirmed a future he hoped we'd avoid. "Now they're not just watching me," he said quietly. "They're watching you." I slid the grocery bag beneath his bed carefully, making sure nothing clinked or shifted. I sat down slowly, my movements deliberate, controlled. For a long time, we didn't open it, not because we were afraid of what was inside, but because we both understood what opening it meant. Once we did, there would be no pause button, no way to pretend we were still observers. Knowledge doesn't just inform, it commits. Hospitals aren't safe places for secrets. Too many people move through them unchecked, too many reasons to be present, too many corners where conversations linger longer than intended. As the hours passed, I began to notice patterns. A man standing near the nurse's station far longer than necessary, pretending to scroll through his phone without ever typing. Another leaning against the wall, reading the same poster again and again without turning the page. Shoes too clean for someone who claimed to be visiting a patient. Eyes too alert for someone waiting casually. They didn't belong to anyone. They weren't family, they weren't staff, they were watching. Thaddeus noticed my gaze shift. "They've started," he said quietly. The words weren't dramatic, they didn't need to be. They were confirmation, not speculation. My stomach tightened, instinctively preparing for impact. Later that night, a doctor pulled me aside near the vending machines. His voice was low, professional, but strained in a way that suggested concern. "Be careful," he said. "Several people asked about him today, not relatives, not officials I recognized. Something felt off. That was enough. The truth was no longer buried behind concrete and dust. It wasn't hidden behind false shelves or forgotten rooms anymore. It was out in the open, even if no one had spoken it aloud yet. It was active, it was moving, and whatever had once been content to let the past rot quietly had noticed the disturbance. I returned to the room and closed the door behind me gently. The bag under the bed felt heavier now, not because its contents had changed, but because its meaning had. It wasn't evidence anymore, it was a signal. And somewhere beyond those walls, people who relied on silence had started paying attention. We didn't open the box until well after midnight, not because we were afraid of what it contained, but because timing matters when the truth is dangerous. The hospital had quieted into its shallow overnight rhythm. Fewer footsteps, fewer voices, less movement that could be tracked or questioned. I locked the door and pulled the curtains closed. The box sat between us on the bed, its metal surface dull under the low light. For a moment, neither of us touched it. The weight of it felt disproportionate to its size, like it carried more than paper and data, like it carried intent. When I finally opened it, there was no dramatic reveal, just folders, neatly labeled, dates written in precise handwriting, official stamps pressed into paper that had never been meant to resurface. I flipped through slowly, careful not to rush. My brain struggled to absorb the scope of what I was seeing. Financial trails mapped with patience, corporate structures layered to confuse, transactions timed to the minute. Then I saw it, my name. Not once, not accidentally, repeated, typed cleanly, signed in places I had never signed, attached to accounts I had never opened, companies I had never heard of, obligations I never agreed to. My hands began to shake. I felt it before I understood it, the debts, the judgments, the financial collapse that had followed me for years like a curse. It wasn't chaos, it was architecture. They used me, I whispered. They used my identity. Thaddeus didn't look surprised. His expression was heavy, resigned, like he had been waiting for me to see this piece for a long time. You were the second layer, he said quietly. If anyone looked too closely at me, responsibility shifted. If they kept digging, it landed on you. I felt dizzy. The room tilted slightly, forcing me to sit down hard on the edge of the bed. Every eviction notice, every court letter. Every time I was denied help because my records were already ruined, manufactured, I flipped through more pages, my breathing shallow. So my life falling apart wasn't an accident, I said. It was part of the system. Yes, he replied. They needed you buried in paperwork and exhaustion. People don't investigate when they're just trying to survive. Tears spilled over, hot and uncontrollable. Why didn't you warn me? I cried. Even a hint, even a sentence. I could have. No, he interrupted sharply, panic cutting through his voice. As long as you didn't know, I still had leverage. The words landed with force. As soon as you knew, he continued, you became a liability. Innocence was the only protection you had. That truth hurt worse than the betrayal I'd believed in for years. My suffering hadn't been collateral damage, it had been strategy. I stood up suddenly, unable to breathe properly, and stumbled out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights felt harsh against my eyes. I sank onto a cold plastic bench, my head in my hands, trying to keep my body from folding in on itself. I wasn't unlucky, I wasn't careless. I had been selected, chosen because I was close enough to be useful and ordinary enough to be ignored, and yet I had survived it. That realization settled slowly, rearranging something deep inside me. The fear didn't disappear, it transformed. The helplessness evaporated first, then the confusion. What replaced them was clarity, sharp, focused, dangerous. I wasn't shaking anymore. I went back into the room, closing the door behind me with purpose. Thaddeus looked up immediately, reading my face the way he always used to. Something had shifted. They built this to destroy me quietly, I said. But it didn't work, he watched me carefully. And now, I continued, they've lost control of the one thing they counted on. What's that? He asked, my silence. For the first time since this began, I understood exactly what I was standing inside. And I was no longer afraid of it. When I walked back into the room, I didn't hesitate. Something had settled inside me during those minutes alone in the hallway. Not courage, not recklessness, decision. The kind that comes when you realize avoidance has already cost you everything it can. I'm not hiding anymore, I said. I didn't choose this, but I won't pretend it isn't mine. Thaddeus stared at me as if I had just stepped into traffic without looking. His face tightened, lines deepening around his eyes. You don't understand what these people are, he warned. They don't threaten, they erase, they don't leave messes, they leave gaps where lives used to be. They already erased mine, I replied. Just slowly enough that no one noticed. He looked away, jaw clenched, like he was watching a future he couldn't stop. That night I started making calls, not reckless ones, calculated ones. Banks that once dismissed me suddenly went quiet when I referenced specific account numbers. Old business partners who hadn't returned my messages in years asked to call me back when I mentioned documentation. Names written in those folders carried weight, even when spoken carefully. Paper doesn't shout, it whispers, and people listen when they recognize the language. Every conversation shifted something. Not enough to feel safe, but enough to confirm that silence had always been my biggest vulnerability. Thaddeus grew weaker by the day. Years of malnutrition don't reverse quickly, no matter how clean the bed or how monitored the fluids. His body was paying invoices long overdue. One afternoon, he reached for my hand, his grip thinner than I remembered. If I don't make it, he said quietly, promise me you won't stop. I didn't hesitate. I promise, outside the hospital, patterns became obvious. Dark sedans parked too often, phones that rang without anyone speaking. A folded note slid under my apartment door one night with a simple message printed neatly. Leave the past where it is. I tore it in half and dropped it into the trash without ceremony, because the past hadn't stayed where it was supposed to. It had followed me, it had shaped me, and it had failed to destroy me. Fear still existed, but it no longer controlled the direction I moved. I understood now that danger doesn't wait for permission. It arrives whether you acknowledge it or not. The only difference is whether you meet it blind or prepared. I wasn't blind anymore. Whatever came next would be deliberate, documented, exposed at the right moment, not the loud one. I had learned the value of timing from the very people who tried to bury me with it. They believed I would remain small, confused, grateful to survive quietly. They were wrong. I wasn't chasing revenge. I wasn't chasing justice. I was reclaiming authorship of my own life. And for the first time since everything began to fall apart, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. When powerful people become afraid, they don't argue, they don't explain, they don't negotiate. They stop talking altogether and start applying pressure in quieter, more personal ways. The note under my door hadn't been the threat. It had been courtesy. I understood that the moment I tore it into pieces and dropped it into the trash. Warnings are extended only when someone still hopes compliance will be easy. After that, explanations end. The next morning, I walked back into my apartment and felt it immediately. The silence was wrong, not quiet, not peaceful, wrong, like the air itself had been rearranged. Like someone else had already moved through the space and left an impression behind. The kind of stillness that doesn't belong to empty rooms. I stood there for a moment without moving, letting my eyes adjust. Nothing was obviously broken at first glance. No shattered glass, no forced entry, no signs of panic. Then I saw the details. Drawers pulled open halfway, their contents rifled through and left scattered. Closet doors hanging crooked, clothes dragged out and tossed aside without care. Frames knocked off shelves, photographs spread across the floor like someone had flipped through my life with gloved hands. They hadn't taken electronics. They hadn't taken cash, they hadn't taken jewelry. They had ignored everything that could be replaced. They had taken one thing, my wedding album. I noticed the empty space on the shelf before I fully processed what it meant. I walked toward it slowly, my steps heavy, my chest tightening as the absence registered. The imprint where it had rested for years was still visible, dust disturbed only there. I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, staring at that space. That wasn't theft, that was communication. We know who you are, we know who mattered to you, we know exactly what to remove to remind you of it. I waited for tears that didn't come, for panic, for collapse. None of it happened. That frightened me more than if it had. Something inside me had gone still, not numb, focused, like my body understood the rules had changed and was adjusting accordingly. At the hospital, Thaddeus knew the moment he saw my face. He didn't ask questions, he didn't need details. Years of living under threat had trained him to read absence and tension better than words. "They came to you," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "And they're finished pretending this is a warning phase." His condition had worsened overnight. His breathing was shallow, labored, like every inhale carried weight. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He looked like someone who had already paid more than his share and was still being charged interest. "They'll go after whatever hurts the most," he whispered. "That's how they work, they don't destroy randomly. They target meaning." I took his hand, holding it firmly. "They already tried," I said, "and I'm still here." He looked at me for a long moment, studying my expression, my posture, the steadiness in my voice. I could see it then, the shift. The realization that the person he'd tried to protect by disappearing no longer needed shielding. The people behind this wanted fear, reaction, retreat. What they were getting instead was resistance that had already survived collapse. And they had just confirmed something critical. They weren't dealing with someone who didn't know the stakes. They were dealing with someone who understood them completely. The city looked ordinary that afternoon. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Traffic moved the way it always did. People walked with purpose, phones in their hands, minds elsewhere. Nothing appeared disrupted. No alarms, no tension anyone else could see. The normalcy was almost convincing. Almost. As soon as I stepped out of the hospital, something inside me tightened. The feeling wasn't new. It was old, buried under years of being told I was imagining things, a pressure between my shoulders. A subtle awareness that space around me wasn't empty the way it should be. Someone was close. I adjusted my pace without turning my head, slowed slightly, then sped up, let my reflection pass across a storefront window. I didn't see a face, I didn't need to. I crossed the street, so did the car, that confirmed it. I changed direction again, sharper this time, forcing myself not to look back. My heartbeat stayed steady, but my body was preparing before my mind finished the thought. Survival doesn't wait for confirmation. The engine revved, not aggressively, not recklessly, controlled, timed. That was when I understood what was happening. The car jumped the curb. There was no screeching tires, no panicked honking, no chaos, just precision. The front end angled directly toward the sidewalk where I stood, calculating distance faster than fear could catch up. I didn't have time to scream. I barely had time to register movement before something slammed into my side. Not metal, not glass, a body. We went down hard together. The impact knocked the breath out of me, pain flashing through my hip and shoulder as we hit the concrete. The world tilted violently, sound rushing back all at once. The car missed me by inches. I saw it only briefly as it corrected course and disappeared into traffic like it had never left the road. No plates I could memorize, no hesitation, just gone. People shouted. Someone dropped a bag. Someone else started yelling for help. A phone appeared above me, already dialing emergency services. The man who had hit me was shaking uncontrollably. Young, pale, eyes wide with shock. He kept apologizing, words tumbling over each other without order. I didn't see you. I was running. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I pushed myself upright slowly, pain blooming everywhere it could. My hands were trembling now, delayed reaction catching up. You didn't hit me, I said, forcing my voice steady. You pulled me out of the way. He stared at me, confused, still trying to process what had happened. You saved my life, I told him. He didn't understand it yet. He wouldn't until later, when shock wore off and memory replayed the moment in clearer detail. Security arrived, police followed, statements were taken. The narrative formed quickly and inaccurately, as narratives like that often do. A reckless driver, an unfortunate near miss. No one pushed too hard. I declined medical transport and returned inside on my own. When I told Thaddeus what happened, he listened without interrupting. His eyes closed halfway through, not in disbelief, but in resignation. They've escalated, he said quietly. That only happens when control starts slipping. The words should have terrified me. Instead, they settled something inside my chest. Escalation meant impatience. Impatience meant mistakes. Mistakes meant exposure. They hadn't tried to scare me. They had tried to remove me, and they had failed. That attempt wasn't a warning. It was proof. Proof that the pressure I was applying mattered. Proof that silence had protected them longer than intimidation ever would. Proof that the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they pretended. As I sat there, replaying the moment frame by frame, something became very clear. They weren't dealing with a passive target anymore. They were dealing with someone who had already survived the worst thing they could design quietly, and now they were being forced into daylight. That night, the waiting ended, not with sirens or shouting, but with a phone call that came later than it should have and earlier than I expected. The number wasn't saved. I almost didn't answer. Instinct told me it mattered. This can't wait anymore, the district attorney said after a brief introduction. His voice carried the strain of someone who had stopped sleeping in full cycles. They're destroying evidence, moving funds, shutting down entities overnight. The pace changed. I leaned against the wall outside Thaddeus's room, steadying myself. So what happens now? I asked. There was a pause, not hesitation, calculation. We move, he said, simultaneously. He outlined it quickly but carefully. Warrants prepared in parallel jurisdictions. Financial freezes timed to the minute. Raids coordinated so no one had time to warn anyone else. Accounts seized before transfers could clear. Physical records secured before shredders could finish their work. Not a single dramatic move. A system collapsing under its own weight. My pulse was loud in my ears, but my hands were steady. When? I asked. Hours, he replied, not days. I ended the call and stood there for a moment, absorbing what that meant. There would be no more preparation time, no more repositioning. Everything that followed would be irreversible. Inside the room, machines beeped in steady intervals, indifferent to the consequences about to ripple outward. Thaddeus lay still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling like he already understood what was coming. They called, I said quietly. He didn't ask who. They're moving, I continued. It's finally happening. He exhaled slowly, a sound that carried more relief than triumph. If this works, he said after a moment, promise me something. What? I asked, stepping closer. Don't let them rewrite it, he said. The story, they always try to clean it up afterward, make themselves look necessary, make people like me look disposable. I leaned closer so he could see my face clearly. They don't get to tell it anymore, I said. We do. Outside the hospital windows, the city moved on, unaware of the shift taking place beneath its surface. Lights stayed on, traffic flowed. People slept, trusting systems they'd never see fail publicly. But somewhere across the city, phones were ringing in rooms where panic wasn't allowed to show. Servers were being accessed for the last time. Doors that had never been knocked on before were about to be opened with warrants attached. The people who built their lives on silence and delay were discovering what happens when neither is available. I stayed with Thaddeus through the night. His breathing was uneven, but his grip on my hand was steady. Years of endurance had carved something permanent into him. He had lived long enough to see the moment arrive, even if it cost him everything else. Just before dawn, I stepped into the hallway and looked out through the glass at the waking city. Somewhere beyond those buildings, teams were already moving. Paperwork was being executed. Accounts were freezing mid-transfer. Doors were opening where no one expected them to. This wasn't justice the way movies frame it. It was structural failure, the kind that can't be undone quietly. And for the first time since the day my life collapsed, I understood something clearly. The clock had always been running, it just hadn't been in my favor. Now it was. You never forget the moment a carefully protected lie collapses in public, not because it is loud, but because of how suddenly it changes the air around you. One second the world feels stable, the next it feels exposed. It was early. Earlier than most people wake up by choice. The kind of hour where streets are quiet and decisions haven't been made yet. Dawn hadn't fully committed to daylight. The hospital was still half asleep, running on overnight staff and muted conversations. The television in Thaddeus's room was on at low volume. No urgency, no alarms, just calm anchors delivering routine updates with practiced neutrality. The colors on the screen were muted, almost dull, like nothing important was supposed to happen yet. Then I heard the name, one name, a name that had appeared in headlines for years, always paired with words like philanthropist, visionary, and community leader. A man photographed smiling at charity dinners. A man who shook hands with politicians and posed for magazine covers that framed him as respectable and necessary. The camera cut to live footage, and there he was, handcuffed, surrounded by federal agents. For a moment, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. It felt unreal, like a dramatization or a misunderstanding that would be corrected any second. My knees weakened before I realized I'd stopped breathing properly. "That's him," Thaddeus whispered from the bed. "I never thought I'd see that." His voice wasn't triumphant, it was stunned, like someone watching gravity briefly reverse. The news anchors adjusted their tone quickly, shifting from routine delivery to careful seriousness. Words like investigation, sealed indictments, and ongoing operation began to replace the earlier calm. They didn't yet know how deep it went, but they knew something significant had broken. By noon, the screen showed more names. Another arrest, another office raided, another set of doors sealed with official tape. Servers were carried out of buildings the public thought were untouchable. Hard drives removed like evidence from a crime scene, not tools of power. Familiar corporate logos appeared behind police barricades. The city buzzed, people whispered in offices. Phones were passed around with news alerts pulled up. Social media erupted into speculation, outrage, disbelief. No one had the full picture yet, but everyone could feel that something rotten had cracked open beneath the surface. For years, these men had existed above consequence. Their influence insulated them. Their reputations shielded them. Their silence controlled outcomes, and now silence was failing. But power doesn't disappear quietly. As the day wore on, my phone started ringing, numbers I didn't recognize, calls that disconnected the moment I answered. Heavy breathing on the line, no words, just presence. At the hospital, the atmosphere shifted too. Unfamiliar faces lingered near nurses' stations again, people who didn't belong but acted like they did, watching, listening, waiting. Thaddeus noticed it without me pointing it out. "This isn't the end," he said quietly. "This is when they panic." I looked at the screen again, at images of men who had believed themselves untouchable now being led into vehicles with cameras flashing. For the first time, the imbalance felt real. They were no longer operating in the shadows alone. They were being forced into the open, and open spaces are dangerous for people who built their lives on control. That night didn't arrive gently. It came like a switch being flipped without warning. Thaddeus's condition changed suddenly, without the slow decline doctors usually prepare you for. One moment his breathing was labored but steady, the next it wasn't. His skin burned with fever, his chest struggled against itself. Machines that had been quietly monitoring him erupted into noise. Alarms sounded, sharp, urgent. Unignorable, doctors rushed in. Nurses moved fast, practiced, efficient. Curtains were pulled closed with a finality that made my stomach drop. Hands guided me backward, away from the bed, away from him. "Please," I said without realizing I was speaking out loud. No one answered. I stood frozen outside the ICU doors, staring through glass that suddenly felt miles thick. Everything inside me wanted to go back in, to do something, anything, but there was nothing I was allowed to do. I had never felt so useless. Minutes stretched into something heavier. Time didn't move correctly, it clung. One doctor finally stepped out and pulled me aside. His expression was professional, controlled, but tired in a way that told me he'd already had this conversation too many times in his career. "He's critical," he said, "severe infection. Respiratory failure, we're doing everything we can." I searched his face for certainty that wasn't there. If he makes it through the next 48 hours, he continued, there's a chance. If. That word lodged itself in my chest and stayed there. I sat in a hard plastic chair outside the ICU for hours, staring at the same section of white wall. I didn't check the time. I didn't check my phone. I just sat there replaying every conversation, every decision, wondering if timing had finally betrayed us. Near dawn, my phone buzzed, the district attorney. We're accelerating everything, he said without preamble. Too many threats. Too many leaks, someone's trying to disrupt the chain. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes. They were scared. People don't rush like that unless they're losing control. And Thaddeus? I asked. He's still protected, he replied. But they're pushing boundaries. We're locking this down. After the call ended, I sat there listening to the hum of machines behind the walls, trying not to imagine how easily systems fail when pressure is applied in the right places. Later that day, a nurse stopped beside me, her voice low. Someone tried to access his medical file, she said. No authorization, no legitimate reason. It blocked it. My hands clenched. They weren't satisfied with intimidation. They weren't satisfied with near misses. They were trying to reach him wherever they could. I looked through the glass at the ICU room. Thaddeus lay motionless, surrounded by equipment doing work his body could no longer manage alone. He had given everything to protect me, and now even unconscious, he was still being treated like a threat that needed to be neutralized. That realization hardened something inside me. This wasn't just retaliation, it was cleanup. They weren't reacting to exposure anymore. They were trying to remove variables, remove witnesses, remove loose ends. I stayed there until visiting hours ended and then stayed longer anyway. Nurses stopped questioning my presence. At some point, you stop looking like someone who can be moved. As night fell again, exhaustion settled into my bones, but sleep never came. Fear stayed active, sharp, alert. Every sound felt intentional. Every footstep in the hall made me look up. They thought pushing harder would make me back off. Instead, it clarified everything. If they were willing to cross this line, it meant we were closer than ever to something that couldn't be buried again. And whatever happened to Thaddeus, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't stepping away. The call came in the evening, after the hospital had settled back into its artificial calm. Machines hummed, shoes whispered against polished floors. The ICU remained sealed, guarded by protocols that didn't care how much history sat on the other side of the glass. I answered without greeting. They broke into my office, the journalist said. His voice was steady but thinner than before. Didn't steal equipment, didn't take files. What did they leave? I asked. A note, he replied. We warned you once. I closed my eyes slowly, letting the words land without reacting to them. Threats lose power when you stop pretending they're surprising. They're not trying to stop the story, I said. They're trying to scare everyone involved into disappearing. That won't work, he replied. Not now. We didn't waste time on reassurance. We moved immediately. Everything was duplicated, not once but multiple times. Encrypted drives, secure servers, physical copies sealed and distributed. Each person involved knew only their part, not the full map, not out of distrust but survival. Compartmentalization had kept our enemies powerful for decades. We were using their own strategies against them. Insurance against erasure. Late that night, the district attorney asked me to come in. His office was dim, the blinds half drawn, the building nearly empty. This wasn't a meeting for records, it was a meeting for reality. This network didn't form overnight, he said, leaning back heavily in his chair. Over 20 years, judges, municipal officials, corporate executives, shell foundations masking transfers. Everyone protecting everyone else. My stomach tightened. And Thaddeus? I asked. He didn't hesitate. He was perfect, the DA said. Clean history, technical authority, no political ambition. Disposable, the word landed harder than anything else he'd said. They needed someone smart enough to sign, honest enough to believe the system would correct itself, and isolated enough to destroy without resistance, he continued. When he tried to report it, they converted him into a shield. I nodded slowly. I already knew this in my bones, but hearing it confirmed stripped away the last traces of doubt. When I returned to the hospital, night had fully taken over. The city outside glowed faintly, unaware of how much of its structure was cracking underneath. I sat beside Thaddeus's bed, machines breathing for him, calculating for him, holding the line while his body rested. His face looked peaceful in a way that felt undeserved after everything he'd carried. They're falling, I whispered. The arrests, the seizures, it's working. His eyelids fluttered. Slowly, with effort, they opened just enough for him to focus on me. Worth it, he breathed. The word was barely audible, but it carried decades inside it. I leaned forward, holding his hand carefully, aware of how fragile he was now, how much damage endurance leaves behind. You didn't just protect me, I said quietly. You exposed them. His fingers tightened weakly around mine. That was always the hope, he murmured. Sitting there, watching machines do what his body could not, something settled into place with terrifying clarity. This was no longer about restoring one man's reputation. It wasn't about clearing debts or correcting records. It wasn't even about justice in the narrow sense people prefer. It was about visibility. About forcing a system that survived on quiet compliance and selective blindness into the open where it could no longer pretend it was necessary. And systems don't forgive exposure. They retaliate, they adapt. They attempt to rebrand themselves as victims of misunderstanding. But once the mask is removed, it never fits the same way again. I stayed until visiting hours ended and then longer still. Nurses stopped questioning my presence. Security nodded when they passed. The narrative had shifted, even here. As I left the room, I looked once more at the man who had been erased so others could remain comfortable. They had failed to erase the truth. And now it was spreading, not loudly, not recklessly, but permanently. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to before. The story was bigger than us, and it was finally being told. Walking into that courtroom felt nothing like justice. It felt controlled, measured, and contained in ways that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with exposure. The building itself seemed designed to remind everyone inside who usually holds power there. The courthouse was full long before proceedings began. Cameras lined the walls. Microphones crowded the aisles. Reporters filled every available space, whispering into phones, rehearsing summaries before anything had even happened. Faces watched closely, searching for emotion they could label, package, and replay. Some wanted blood. Some wanted forgiveness, most wanted spectacle. I wasn't there as a spouse. I wasn't there as someone seeking sympathy. I was there because what I carried couldn't be dismissed anymore. I was evidence. When my name was called, the room shifted in a way I felt physically. Chairs creaked, breathing changed. The air tightened as if everyone understood this moment mattered more than the speeches that would follow. I walked to the stand calmly. Years of being scrutinized, doubted, and dismissed had taught me how to move without flinching. The men seated at the defense tables looked different under this light. These were people who once commanded rooms without speaking loudly. People whose signatures redirected millions. People whose confidence came from never being questioned. Now some of them couldn't meet my eyes. Others stared openly, their expressions hardened like betrayal had just been committed against an unspoken agreement. As if I had violated a rule that protected them for decades, the district attorney began methodically. No dramatics, no grandstanding, dates, transactions, corporate filings. Contracts layered on contracts designed to obscure responsibility. Then he handed me the folder. "Do you recognize these documents?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice didn't shake. For years, I believed they were proof I had failed at life, proof that I had made reckless choices, that I deserved what happened to me. A murmur moved through the courtroom. "These papers were used to bury us," I continued. "They were tools designed to destroy two people quietly so many others could remain protected." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth carried its own weight. One of the defendants stood suddenly, unable to contain himself. "She's lying," he shouted. "She was manipulated by a disgraced engineer." The judge's gavel struck hard against the bench. "That disgraced engineer," the judge said coldly, "was systematically silenced so men like you could continue operating without scrutiny." The courtroom went still. No murmurs, no whispers, just the sound of consequences finally arriving. I looked across the room again. This time, the confidence was gone. What remained was calculation and fear. Exposure had shifted the balance in a way no defense strategy could undo. For the first time, they understood something essential. They were no longer untouchable. They were visible. And visibility is the one thing power built on secrecy cannot survive. 3 days passed after the courtroom testimony, but time didn't move the way it used to. It stretched, folded back on itself, then stalled completely. The hospital remained suspended in its artificial rhythm, where mornings and nights mattered less than vital signs and chart updates. Thaddeus was awake more often now, though weak. His body hadn't recovered from years of deprivation, stress, and damage, but his mind was clearer than I had seen it in decades. Something about watching the truth surface had steadied him. As if the weight he'd carried alone had finally been acknowledged by the world that ignored it. That morning, the door to his room opened without the usual knock. The district attorney stepped inside. He didn't smile. He didn't sit down. He stood formally at the foot of the bed, posture straight, voice careful in a way that signaled this wasn't a courtesy visit. "Mr. Thaddeus," he said, "all charges against you have been officially dropped." The words didn't land immediately. Thaddeus blinked once, then again, his brow furrowed slightly like he was searching for the hidden clause, the condition that always followed relief. "Every charge," the DA continued. "Every financial allegation. Every civil attachment connected to this case." I felt my breath leave my lungs all at once. "Your name has been cleared," he said. "The state formally recognizes you as a victim of long-term criminal extortion and coercion." I grabbed Thaddeus's hand without thinking, gripping it tightly, grounding us both. You hear that? I whispered. They can't touch you anymore. His fingers trembled in mine. For a moment he said nothing. Then a tear slid from the corner of his eye, slow and unguarded, not dramatic, not loud. Just the quiet release of something that had been held too long. All these years, he murmured, they finally said it out loud. The DA's voice softened, dropping its official edge. What you did dismantled one of the most entrenched corruption networks this state has ever prosecuted, he said. Your disappearance wasn't cowardice, it was survival under threat. Thaddeus let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. So I didn't vanish for nothing, he said weakly. No, the DA replied, you didn't. Paperwork followed, forms, statements, signatures that finally worked in our favor instead of against us. With each page completed, something invisible loosened in the room, a tension I hadn't realized I was still carrying. After the DA left, silence filled the space again, but this time it wasn't oppressive. It felt earned. I sat beside Thaddeus, still holding his hand. They took it all back, I said quietly. The lies, the labels, the damage, he nodded slowly. I always knew the truth would surface eventually, he said. I just didn't think I'd still be here to hear it. I squeezed his hand gently. You are, I said, that matters. Outside the window, the city moved on as if nothing monumental had happened. People went to work, traffic flowed. Coffee was poured, most of them would never understand how close everything had come to staying buried forever. But inside that room, something irreversible had occurred. A man erased by design had been restored by record, not as a hero. Not as a symbol, but as a human being whose life had been deliberately broken and finally acknowledged. And for the first time since the beginning of this nightmare, the truth wasn't something we had to defend. It was official. Justice never arrives alone. It brings consequences with it, and someone always pays more than they should. That night, the hospital changed again. The quiet balance we had settled into shattered without warning. One moment, the room was still. The next, alarms cut through the air, sharp and relentless, tearing away any illusion of stability. Thaddeus's body gave out without ceremony. Internal bleeding, sudden, severe. Doctors moved fast, voices raised, instructions overlapping. The bed rolled away from me as hands guided it toward the emergency room. I followed until I was stopped at the doors, the line drawn clearly and without negotiation. I stood there knowing something had shifted permanently. This wasn't fear anymore, it was recognition. I understood, truly understood, that justice does not undo damage. It names it, it exposes it, but it doesn't rewind bodies or restore years lost to survival. I paced the hallway, then stopped, sat down, stood again, time fractured into meaningless pieces. I watched the doors like they might answer me if I stared long enough. When a nurse finally approached, her face told me what her words hadn't reached yet. They're doing everything they can, she said carefully. I nodded because there was nothing else to do. Hours passed, maybe minutes. The clock stopped making sense. When they let me in, the room was louder than before. Machines filled the space with mechanical breathing, calculating rhythms, artificial steadiness. Thaddeus lay still beneath the weight of it all, smaller than I remembered, thinner than a life should allow. He opened his eyes once, just once. Did they fall? He whispered, his voice barely carried across the space between us. Yes, I said, tears finally breaking through. They're falling fast. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost peaceful. Then it was worth it, he said. I leaned closer, resting my forehead against his hand. The room smelled sterile, unreal, like grief wasn't allowed to fully exist there. I never hated you, I said quietly. It wasn't true, but it was kind. And kindness mattered more than accuracy in that moment. A faint smile touched his mouth, just enough to be real, just enough to know he heard me. Then he was gone. The machines continued for a moment, unaware that their purpose had ended. When they stopped, the silence felt heavier than any sound had. Outside that room, the country was unraveling a scandal that would take years to fully understand. Headlines multiplied, careers ended, systems fractured, reforms were promised. Inside that room, none of that mattered. A man who gave everything to protect someone else had paid the final cost. I sat there long after the staff left, holding a hand that no longer needed holding, thinking about how easily history forgets the people who absorb damage so others never see it coming. Thaddeus wasn't a martyr. He was a human being placed into an impossible position and forced to choose between destruction and disappearance. He chose love. When I finally stood to leave, the hallway felt different, not threatening. Not heavy, just quiet in a way that acknowledged something had ended properly. Justice had spoken. But the bill had been paid in advance with interest by someone who never asked to be remembered for it. And that was the truth I would carry forward, not as vengeance, not as bitterness, but as responsibility, because the cost of silence is always higher than anyone admits, and now, at last, it had been counted. Some men die without applause, without headlines, without their names ever being spoken at the right time. and sometimes the world only learns who they were after they're gone, when it's too late for gratitude to matter. Thaddeus's death didn't slow anything down. If anything, it accelerated what had already begun. Investigations widened, charges multiplied, names that had lived safely behind closed doors were suddenly spoken aloud on every channel. Men who once dictated outcomes were photographed in moments they never imagined would exist, handcuffed, disoriented, scrambling for lawyers who couldn't promise miracles anymore. News coverage ran nonstop. Panels debated responsibility. Experts explained corruption as if it were a theory instead of something that had eaten real lives. Every development was framed as history unfolding. None of it felt real to me. Because while the world was watching power collapse, I was planning a funeral. I buried the man who had saved my life. There were no cameras at the service, no statements prepared, no speeches about justice or sacrifice. Just a handful of people who understood that silence sometimes carries more truth than words ever could. The cemetery was quiet, ordinary, the kind of place people drive past without noticing, unaware of how many stories end there without acknowledgement. The sky was neutral, no dramatic weather, no symbolism offered by nature, just ground. I stood there while they lowered the coffin, listening to the soft sound of earth being returned where it came from. That sound stayed with me longer than anything said that day. I didn't cry, not because I didn't feel it, but because grief had already spent itself over years of uncertainty, fear, and waiting. Some losses don't arrive all at once. They happen slowly until there's nothing left to release. This was the quiet end of something I had been mourning for a long time. A prosecutor approached me after most people had left. He spoke carefully, like someone who understood this wasn't a professional moment anymore. There will be reparations, he said. Financial compensation, formal acknowledgement. A public apology. I looked at the fresh dirt covering the coffin. None of that brings him back, I replied, but maybe it keeps someone else alive. That wasn't generosity, it was reality. Justice can correct records. It can restore names, it can even shift systems if it's allowed to go far enough, but it cannot undo sacrifice. What Thaddeus gave wasn't meant to be repaid, it was meant to be endured so someone else wouldn't have to pay the same price. As I left the cemetery, the world didn't pause. Cars passed, phones rang. Somewhere, another press conference was being prepared. Somewhere else, someone was realizing their immunity had expired, and none of it belonged to me anymore. My part was finished, not because the story had ended, but because my role in it had changed. I was no longer fighting for answers. I was carrying them, and carrying the truth forward quietly without spectacle felt like the only way to honor a man who never wanted attention, only safety for someone he loved. After the court dates were set and the last major arrests were announced, the world did what it always does. It moved on. The story that once dominated every screen slowly slipped down the headlines. New scandals replaced old ones. New villains took the spotlight. The same anchors who once spoke his name with gravity now mention the case only in passing, as background context for something fresher, louder, easier to digest. Justice had a shelf life, my life didn't. When the noise faded, what remained was quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the honest kind. The kind that forces you to hear your own thoughts without interruption. The kind that doesn't ask how you're doing before settling in beside you. I sold the apartment where I had lived during the worst years. The place where every wall held memories I didn't choose, where survival had been the primary emotion and hope something borrowed in short supply. Walking through it one last time felt less like leaving and more like closing a door that had been open too long. I didn't take much with me, just what mattered. I bought a smaller place across town, nothing impressive. No view meant to signal success, just clean light in the mornings and quiet in the evenings, windows that opened, rooms that didn't echo with old arguments or unanswered questions, space to breathe. For the first time in years, I slept without listening for sounds that didn't belong. I woke up without dread pressing on my chest before my eyes even opened. The absence of constant vigilance felt strange at first, like forgetting something important. It took time to understand that safety can feel unfamiliar when you've lived without it long enough. I didn't redecorate much. One photo went up on the wall, our wedding day, not because it represented perfection. Not because it erased what followed, but because it was honest. It captured who we were before fear rewrote everything, before systems intervened, before survival required erasure. He looked at me in that photo like the world had already been decided. I kept it not as a lie, but as context. A reminder that the man the world eventually acknowledged wasn't defined by the years he disappeared, but by the choice he made when it mattered most. Friends asked if I was angry, if I felt empty, if I regretted how much had been lost. The truth was quieter than any answer they expected. I felt steady. Loss had stripped my life down to essentials. And in doing so, it had clarified what mattered and what never had. I no longer measured success in noise, recognition, or outcome. I measured it in peace, in integrity, in whether I could live with my own decisions without flinching. Some nights were still hard. Grief doesn't leave because it's inconvenient. It revisits when it wants to. But it no longer arrived with confusion or rage. It arrived with memory, and memory no longer felt like an enemy. The world might remember the case as a turning point, as an exposé, as proof that corruption can be dismantled. I remembered it as something simpler. A man loved someone enough to disappear so she could live. And when the noise finally faded, that truth remained intact, unchanged by headlines, untouched by time. Weeks passed before I was ready to touch the last box. It sat in the corner of the new apartment, sealed and undisturbed, like it understood it wasn't meant to be opened casually. I had unpacked everything else: clothes, books, documents that no longer carried threat, but that box remained where it was, quiet and patient. Some truths wait for strength. I opened it on a morning when the light was soft and the world outside seemed undecided about the day. No appointments, no obligations, just time that belonged to me. Inside were remnants of a life that never finished unfolding. Old files, notes written in margins, receipts saved for reasons that no longer mattered, and then, folded carefully between two legal folders, I found the paper. The handwriting stopped me before I read a single word: his steady. Precise, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten instantly. I sat down on the floor and unfolded it slowly, like the paper itself might bruise if handled too roughly. If you're reading this, I'm gone. There was no drama in the sentence. No attempt to soften it, just acceptance. He had known this was possible, maybe inevitable, and instead of fear, he had left clarity. Don't remember me as the man who fell. The words blurred briefly as my vision wavered. I waited until it cleared before continuing. Remember me as the man who loved you enough to lose everything. I closed my eyes then, pressing the paper lightly between my hands. Not to stop the tears, they came anyway, but to stay present with them, to let them exist without being pushed away or turned into something else. Saving you was my only victory. That line broke me in a way nothing else had. Not loudly, not violently, honestly, the kind of breaking that doesn't shatter but opens. I sat there for a long time, the letter resting in my lap, breathing unevenly, letting the weight of it settle fully for the first time. Not the weight of loss, I had carried that for years, but the weight of intention. Everything he had done suddenly aligned into a single, devastatingly simple truth. He hadn't been running, he hadn't been hiding. He hadn't been surviving for himself. He had been guarding a line he refused to let anyone cross. Me. For the first time since the beginning of all this, anger didn't show up, not even a trace. There was no resentment left to negotiate with, no unanswered questions demanding resolution, only gratitude, wrapped tightly in grief. I realized then that grief changes shape when truth replaces speculation. It no longer claws. It settles, it becomes something you carry instead of something that drags you. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box, not because I was done with it, but because it deserved rest too. Later that day, I walked to the window and watched the city move. Ordinary life continued below. People hurried. Cars stopped and started. Someone laughed on a sidewalk I couldn't hear. The world hadn't stopped for him. But it didn't have to. His choice had already done what it was meant to do. I was alive. I was free. I was no longer guessing. And that was enough. I didn't need monuments. I didn't need recognition. I would carry him quietly, the way he carried me, not as a tragedy, but as proof that love, when chosen deliberately, can survive even the systems designed to erase it. That letter didn't give me closure. It gave me permission. To live without fear, to remember without bitterness, to move forward without forgetting. Some truths arrive too late to change the past, but they arrive exactly on time to shape the future. And this one would stay with me, not as pain, but as purpose, for the rest of my life. Peace doesn't arrive with announcements. It doesn't knock. It doesn't make promises. It slips in quietly when you're no longer bracing for impact, when your body finally understands that vigilance is no longer required. The morning after everything ended, I woke up and lay still for a long time. Nothing pulled me out of sleep. No phone vibrating on the nightstand. No sharp jolt of dread before consciousness fully formed, just silence. Not the kind that feels empty or threatening, the kind that feels complete. For years, waking up meant scanning immediately for danger, listening for sounds that didn't belong, replaying conversations, anticipating consequences before the day even started. Fear had been my alarm clock for so long that I didn't trust mornings without it. That day, fear didn't show up. I got out of bed slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wasn't rushing away from anything. My small apartment was filled with soft light, nothing dramatic, nothing symbolic. Just an ordinary morning that didn't demand anything from me. I made coffee without checking my phone, let the water heat fully, watched steam rise, stood there and realized my hands weren't shaking. That alone felt unfamiliar. I carried the mug to the window and stood there, barefoot, watching the city exist without me having to manage it. Below, children laughed in the park. Someone argued playfully with a friend. A dog pulled against its leash, impatient to explore. Life was happening, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next interruption, the next threat, the next loss. My mind didn't replay old moments. It didn't rehearse defenses, it didn't calculate exits. It rested. I thought about everything that had ended quietly. The courtrooms emptied, the headlines faded. The people who once felt omnipresent were now contained by systems they believed they controlled. The danger that had stalked my days receded not with drama, but with absence. I realized then that freedom isn't loud. Freedom is the ability to exist without preparing for harm. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't recognized. I wasn't celebrated for surviving something most people would never understand. I was simply living without fear, and that was more than enough. I thought about Thaddeus not with pain, but with clarity. His choice had given me this moment. Not the apartment, not the quiet, this feeling of safety that didn't require explanation. He had carried the weight so I wouldn't have to, and now that the weight was gone, I understood something deeply personal and deeply true. Peace isn't something you chase, it's something that arrives when the threat finally leaves your body. That morning, as the city continued without acknowledging what had ended for me, I finished my coffee and breathed in without hesitation. Nothing was waiting to hurt me, nothing was hiding behind routine, nothing was coming, and in that absence I found what I had been denied for most of my life: not happiness, not triumph, peace. People asked me if I felt satisfied when the verdicts came down. They asked it carefully, as if the answer might crack something open again, as if satisfaction was the expected outcome, the natural reward for surviving what I had survived. They wanted to know if watching powerful men lose everything had healed me. It hadn't. Seeing them sentenced didn't bring relief. It didn't undo the years of damage. It didn't return what was taken or soften the cost that had already been paid. Watching someone fall is loud, it draws attention, but it doesn't reach the places where pain actually lives. What healed me was quieter than that. What healed me was knowing the truth, knowing I hadn't been abandoned. Knowing my suffering hadn't been random. Knowing my life hadn't collapsed because I was weak, careless, or unworthy. For years, I had carried questions that had no answers, questions that turned inward and became accusations. I replayed decisions, judged myself harshly, believed that if I had been smarter, stronger, more aware, everything would have turned out differently. The truth dismantled that lie completely. The truth told me something simple and devastating. I had been loved not in a way that was easy or visible, not in a way that protected comfort or reputation. I had been loved in a way that demanded disappearance, sacrifice, silence, endurance, knowing that changed everything. It reframed my past in a way no sentence ever could. The years that once felt like punishment now made sense as consequence, not of failure, but of choice. Someone else had chosen to absorb harm so I wouldn't have to. Justice, I learned, isn't about spectacle. It isn't about watching people pay publicly. That kind of justice is performative. It satisfies observers more than it restores those who were harmed. Real justice is internal. It's the moment when a lie loses its power over you, when shame no longer has a voice, when fear stops narrating your life. I didn't need to see them suffer. I needed to stop suffering myself, and that came from truth, not revenge. Revenge demands attention. It stays loud. It keeps wounds open by revisiting them over and over again. It asks you to remain emotionally tethered to the people who harmed you, even after they're gone. Truth does the opposite. Truth is quiet. Truth is stable. Truth doesn't require witnesses to exist. Once I understood what had happened, truly understood it, the story lost its grip on me. I no longer needed to explain myself. I no longer needed validation from outcomes or apologies or recognition. I could stand inside my own life without flinching. That's what justice gave me, not a sense of victory, a sense of grounding. I stopped asking what should have happened. I stopped imagining alternate endings. I stopped replaying conversations that never occurred. Those loops dissolved on their own once truth took their place. The world saw justice as punishment. I experienced it as release. The lie couldn't touch me anymore. And when a lie loses access to your mind, it loses everything. Surviving doesn't feel heroic when it finally happens. There's no moment where music swells or clarity strikes all at once. Survival settles into you slowly, like your body relearning something it forgot was possible. Safety doesn't announce itself, it just stops demanding explanations. I walk differently now, not faster, not slower, just without scanning faces, without measuring footsteps behind me, without calculating exits in every room I enter. My shoulders rest where they used to tense. My breath moves in and out without interruption. I sleep through the night. That alone feels like a victory no one can take away. For years, sleep was shallow and conditional, a series of half-awakenings, my mind never fully shutting off. Even dreams felt like negotiations with fear. Now, rest comes without argument. I wake up without bracing myself for consequences I haven't earned. I don't chase justice anymore. I don't chase revenge either. At 67, I chase mornings. Light through the window, the simple luxury of time that isn't filled with urgency, the quiet satisfaction of choosing how to spend a day without explaining why. I sit with my coffee and feel present instead of prepared. I listen to sounds without assigning meaning to them. I exist without apology. People assume survival means you've reached the end of something. That once the danger is gone, the story stops. But survival isn't an ending, it's proof. Proof that something tried to erase you and failed. I don't feel powerful. I feel intact. That distinction matters. Power seeks dominance. Intactness seeks balance. I no longer need to prove resilience. I don't need to demonstrate strength. I don't need to show anyone what I endured to justify where I stand now. I stand because I'm here. Thaddeus lost everything so I could live, not so I could carry anger forward, not so I could build a monument to suffering, so I could live freely without chains I didn't choose. I honor that by living honestly. By not shrinking myself, by not pretending the past didn't shape me, by not allowing it to dictate my future either. I carry him with me in small ways, in decisions made calmly, in boundaries that don't require explanation. In the quiet refusal to let fear narrate my days, I don't talk about what happened often, not because it's secret, but because it's complete. The story has an ending that doesn't need revisiting. It rests now where it belongs. What remains is life, ordinary, unspectacular, deeply precious life. I buy groceries without looking over my shoulder. I walk home without rehearsing danger. I laugh without checking whether it's safe to be heard. These things used to feel impossible. Now they're routine. That's how I know it's real. Every morning I wake up and recognize the absence of fear before I recognize the day. That absence is the inheritance he left me, not money. Not recognition, not justice in the public sense. Freedom. And every morning I give quiet thanks for one simple truth that survived everything meant to destroy it. I am still here, not because I fought harder than anyone else. Not because I was braver, but because love, chosen deliberately, endured longer than corruption ever could. And that is enough.